Hey y'all, Dr. Baird here. So I wanted to go over the process of thematic analysis with you. So before we begin, I'll preface this with a couple of things. First, all of the resources that I'm going to be using in this video, you'll have open access to in course resources on Scholar. The other thing I wanted to note is this is just as much for my socialization class as it is my seniors who are doing thematic analysis to code some sort of artifact that they want respondents to respond to within their survey. So know that I may make reference to both, but this basic process applies equally to both of your projects. So that said, let's go ahead and begin. So first, obviously, it's necessary to answer what is thematic analysis. The formal definition of thematic analysis from Kiger and Vaprio, an article you have access to, is a method of analyzing qualitative data that entails searching across a data set to identify, analyze, and report repeated patterns. So, at the core of this process, all you're doing is recognizing repeated patterns. This is something that, in all honesty, you do naturally just as a human being in this world. That's what humans do, is they look at the world around them, they try and identify what is going on around them by trying to see what the patterns are. What is repeated? What are the trends? And this applies as much to the natural world as it does to the social world. We make sense of the world around us, and we make sense of what's going on around us by recognizing trends. And so all this is kind of a formalized method of doing what you do anyways, just in a more systematic and well-documented way. And so one of the benefits I feel like there is, or one of the benefits of qualitative analysis, the kind of analysis that you're fundamentally doing, the little bit of sociology that you're doing, is that it is something that you kind of naturally do anyways if you're somebody who is inquisitive about the social world around you. And so at the core of this process, you are merely exploring. You aren't necessarily testing a scientific hypothesis the way you would in quantitative data analysis or another kind of social science. You are merely looking at the world around you, or an element of the world around you, and trying to explore it to recognize the patterns. And so for all of you, you'll all have a very similar research question, an exploratory research question, in which you ask, what are the core elements of X thing that are observable in X content or X social context, your artifact? So, as much as I have here in the slide here, what are the core elements of X form of socialization? This doesn't have to be a form of socialization if it is the case that you are doing this for your senior sem. But what is the fundamental social process going on that you are observing in the artifacts that you are finding? So let's say you are doing something on gender socialization, which could be a senior STEM project or it could be a socialization project. And you want to examine Barbie ads from the 90s, which actually would be really, really interesting. I'm pretty sure all of those are on YouTube somewhere. But you could ask the question, what are the core elements of gender socialization that are observable in Barbie ads from the 1990s? So just take that social process and that artifact, and you can plug in whatever. At the end of the day, all of you are going to have really similar research questions, at least when it comes to doing this thematic analysis. Now, if you're in my senior sim, this is going to lead into a more specific quantitative research question, but if you're in socialization, you don't have to worry about that at all. For this process of thematic analysis, your fundamental question is that really basic question. So one of the things that I want you to be able to do in engaging this qualitative research is kind of broaden your definition of what data is. We have a tendency to think of data in quantitative terms, which is to say, when we think of data, we oftentimes think of numbers. But that's a really, really narrow definition of what data is. Ultimately, data can come in one of two forms: quantitative data, numbers, or qualitative data, which are just observations about anything else in the world. Data is fundamentally just information that can be observed. Anything that can be observed can be data. And so the same way that patterns in numbers that you may do statistics with this data, patterns in observed behavior that you may write down in code, as we'll get into, is also data. So I want you to broaden your definition of what is data out a little bit to include basically anything that's in the observable world. And so when it comes to the social sciences, that can include spoken or written words, which basically, I guess, could encompass a large variety of things. It could also be nonverbal communication as well. That can be observed, and you can find patterns in that. So for the artifacts that you choose, you have a wide range of possibility, because whether it be video, audio, pre-written word, all of those have words that communicate something. And even if they're not already in written words, you can certainly transcribe them. Behaviors you can observe as well. You can write down what you observe from behaviors in a video or in the natural world and find the patterns with that. Also, this could be artistic expressions or depictions. That is fundamentally the purpose of art, is to communicate something. So obviously, if art is coherent or, halfway thought out, generally it is trying to communicate something, have some sort of a message. And in order to have a message, there's generally patterns within that art. So this same basic process that can be used to explore the natural world or behaviors in the world around us or in media can also be used to kind of deconstruct and recognize patterns within artistic depictions. So what is a theme? A theme is what you will all be working towards, or several themes. A theme is really any reoccurring idea, concept, or behavioral pattern that answers your research question. So it can be any pattern that is observable. So we will get into breaking down your artifacts through codes to develop themes. So themes are constructed from codes, which we will get into. But the relationship between themes and how they're constructed out of codes is really the core idea that I want you to get out of this video. So when it comes to themes, it's important to think about it in relationship to your research question. So a theme is basically an answer to your research question. So if we go back and look at your research question, let's use the example of, how do Barbie ads from the 1990s socialize gender? The themes that you developed from that question, if you were to use those ads as artifacts, would be an answer to your question. And so, like, each answer to that question, or each form of gender socialization that you can observe within the ads, that would be a theme or an answer to that question. Now, one of the important things to note about qualitative research is that it's by its nature open-ended and exploratory, which means that it's, quote, inductive. Inductive is where you're looking for all the potential answers. You're exploring. And generally, an inductive research question is one that is open-ended, much like the example that I just gave. Like, for example, how does social media socialize teens? There's no one right answer to that. There's many, many, many answers to that. And so a inductive kind of qualitative process like thematic analysis would be appropriate in exploring that. Now, the other side of science in the scientific method is the deductive method. This is where you are answering closed-ended questions to confirm that something is or is not the answer. This is where you have more specific hypotheses. And for those of you who are in my senior SEM, that's what you will be working towards eventually. So that tends to be more closed-ended specific questions like, do teens that use social media rate themselves more negatively in terms of body image? That's a closed-ended yes-no type question that can be turned into a hypothesis that you could test. But that's also not the type of thing that we're doing within thematic analysis. Your codes quite literally are what you directly observe coming out of your data in the artifacts. So codes are just specific observations from the artifacts that will fit within your broader themes. Now, when you start your initial coding, one of the things that I want you to keep in mind is that you shouldn't have your themes already in mind when you start your initial coding. Your themes are going to arise organically out of the codes that you observe. When you start doing your initial coding, you should just be familiarizing yourself with the data that is in the artifacts. And so try and be an objective observer and just break down exactly what it is that you are seeing in terms of behaviors or messages coming out of that individual artifact. And so the nature of codes is they oftentimes are repeated. That's how they develop into themes. So bear in mind that individual codes may be in individual artifacts multiple times. Also, it may be the case that codes appear multiple times in different artifacts as well. That's to be expected. But as of right now, when you're doing your coding, or as of the beginning of your project, just focus on what you are quite literally seeing. Now, I'm going to go ahead and go into an example because I feel like codes are the type of concept when you hear me explain it in the abstract, it can be a little bit confusing. But once you actually see it in action, it's actually really intuitive and makes really easy sense. So what I have here is an interview transcript, a really short one, only about 2 minutes of spoken word. And so this is from a researcher who's trying to answer, what are the perceived causes of modern people getting too little exercise? And so in order to answer that open-ended question, this researcher did a brief interview with 2 different people. And one of the things you'll notice here is there's not a whole lot of spoken word here. Like I said, this is only about 2 minutes of text, but I managed to pull 20 different codes out of this. So this can be a process that is really, really fruitful. I think one of the benefits of understanding this process is that you understand just how densely packed social interactions and conversations are with meaning that is socially significant. And so as such, you can pull a lot of codes out of just a little bit of data. So for instance, my transcript here reads, Sally responds, I think it's a huge effect because I remember, say, 40 years ago, we had a lot more industry in this country. So people were actually what you might call working harder. I know we all work hard, but working more. She clarifies physically. Sally says physically harder. You know, we didn't all have cars, so like my mom, it's worth noting that Sally's English, used to walk 2 or 3 miles to go to the train station, to go another 10 miles to work. You know, it was like there was more impact. There was no bus for her, so she had to walk. And nowadays, we think, oh, I can't do that. Can't miles to go and do that. It is also worth noting that this is direct quotes, and oftentimes people don't speak terribly eloquently. Rebecca, also being interviewed, says, take the car, yeah, humans are naturally lazy. Yeah, exactly. Rebecca, yeah. I think over the decades, as technology advanced, our lifestyle has changed, and it's had an impact on society now. So we've got kids growing up who are going, you know, mama, who are sorry, who are growing up thinking, oh well, if I just jump in the car, mom will take me so take me to so and so, or they're not in that sort of exercise as a luxury. You go and you have to motivate yourself to go to the gym. Where at one time you didn't have to go to the gym because you worked physically or whatever, and now we have to motivate, and I'm not motivated. So, one of the things I'll note there is it can be kind of difficult to parse out exactly what they're saying because humans have kind of awkward speaking patterns, especially if you're doing naturalistic interviews. People aren't going to sound like a scripted TV show. It's probably easier to code something like a scripted TV show because people are speaking for maximum clarity and not necessarily how people actually speak. And the way people actually speak when transcribed oftentimes can be confusing, and sometimes you need to read over it multiple times to parse out exactly what is being said. But that is just the nature of human communication that we oftentimes overlook. But that said, there is, in spite being not very many words here, a lot going on. I was able to parse out 20 different codes. Between these three small paragraphs, I noted that there was a code for the importance of modernity being an important factor of influencing obesity, modern lifestyles being sedentary, a lack of physical work nowadays, hard physical work being beneficial to avoid obesity, times having changed, people having a choice in exercise today whereas they didn't in the past, physical activity being integral to the part of the past, exercise as negative or people viewing it as a chore, an implicit ideal that people should be fit or physically active and thin, humans being naturally lazy, a negative impact on technology, on people wanting to exercise, people having different lifestyles than in the past, kids learning bad behaviors from their parents, exercise being a negative that people view as unpleasant, exercise as not a natural desire for human beings, exercise as a necessary evil, exercise isn't a part of everyday life, exercise is a choice that we don't generally make. Exercise as something that is exceptional and expensive and not easily integrated into your lifestyle, and exercise requiring something extra in terms of willpower or discipline that perhaps goes beyond the typical person. And so, what you see in the transcript is for each one of my codes, I placed a code, next to where I saw it in the transcript. Now, because the way people speak and like the nature of transcripts and social interaction is things are repeated over and over and over, oftentimes you'll see a lot of the codes are relatively similar to one another. They all seem to be kind of interrelated. And certainly multiple codes come up multiple times, but that is generally how people interact with one another. The same basic patterns come up over and over and over again, and in a little bit of speech, you'll see the same thing come up time after time after time, and eventually we'll develop these into themes. So this is how it starts. And you'll end up having a lot to manage here in terms of putting your codes to the given transcript or whatever it is that you're doing. You could be doing a video and perhaps you do timestamps or something rather than transcribing the entire video. But either way, one of the things I'll go ahead and recommend to you right now is keep your work organized. Perhaps like I did here, just with a table that I made in MS Word. You could use Excel. But you're going to end up with a lot of notes and a lot of codes because there's generally going to be a lot of observations that are going to be relevant to your research question. And so be prepared going into this process to keep everything organized so you can go over it later to develop your themes. In sitting down with the codes I was able to produce, I ended up seeing three distinct themes that came out of that little bit of transcript data that we were using as our artifact. The first and most prominent one that I noticed was that they seem to suggest that modern society has changed in ways that encourage human beings to be more sedentary. And that makes sense as an explanation as to why we do less exercise. Cars or other modern technology makes it so that we can live our day-to-day life and avoid exercise. And consistently what came up in the codes is those being interviewed suggesting that back in the day, it was the case that exercise was something that was integrated into our lives. And it was something that people didn't even necessarily have to think about because you had to exercise inherently to survive or in order to make your day-to-day life work. Whereas that's not necessarily the case now. And so that was the first most prominent theme I saw. I also saw two others. The second being exercise running counter to our very nature as human beings. Those who were interviewed seemed to think that human beings were kind of naturally lazy. And we have a choice to exercise now, and generally it's a choice that we don't make. Perhaps because humans see exercise as inherently unpleasant, because perhaps we're inherently lazy, and that it's not a natural desire for us to exercise if given the opportunity not to. So that was a pretty prominent theme. And then lastly, the third theme I would say was the least prominent, but definitely still present. The notion that consistent exercise is something that is prohibitively difficult, at least for a modern person. It requires carving time out of your life and making a concerted effort to do it, perhaps against our nature. And so this fits with the other themes pretty well, that, not only is modern life not encourage us to exercise, but actively makes it difficult to do so because you have to set aside time, you have to make effort, it can perhaps be expensive, you have to go to the gym. And so in many ways, not only is it a chore that people don't like doing, but it's also prohibitively difficult to do because of expense and time. So it's a chore, but it's also to a certain extent a luxury if you get to do it. And so all of these themes fit really well in terms of answering my research question. Why is it that modern people exercise less? And it came out of all just 2 minutes of audio. Naturally, this is just these two people's perspectives. And also, naturally, it's the case that other people may code and develop themes differently off this data than I did. Which is okay. That's kind of part of the nature of exploratory qualitative analysis, like thematic analysis. To a certain extent, your own subjectivity and the subjectivity of those you are observing are built in to this process. So qualitative research, and especially thematic analysis, is a form of social science in which we, to a certain extent, embrace the subjectivity that is inherently built into our observations and our data. So just to give you an overview, these are the specific steps of thematic analysis as broken down by Geiger and Vieto, the authors of the most recent and all-encompassing article on thematic analysis. You have access to that in your course resources. But to break it down step by step, the way that they do, there are 5 steps. First, familiarizing yourself with your data. There's no shortcuts around the fact that in order to understand something, you just have to be exposed to it. And so before you even begin coding, I would advise reading whatever your artifact is multiple times, or viewing or listening to it. Whatever form your artifact is in, you should expose yourself to it multiple times. Artifacts are a lot like listening to songs. And the first time you hear a song, you certainly don't catch it all. The first time you hear a song, you might not even like it. But you listen to a song again, and you catch something new. Once more, and you catch something new. Once more, and maybe you catch something really big you didn't see in the first place that took 4 times to listen to. And so, naturally, this is just a course project. I don't want you to, perhaps spend all night poring over this. But you should begin just merely by exposing yourself to the artifacts multiple times and taking in your own way, naturally, the information that is coming from them. Then generate the initial codes. Quite literally write down what it is that you are seeing, what is being communicated. Don't be afraid to read into subtext. Oftentimes people speak in ways that are metaphorical, or they infer things without directly saying it. That's fine to put in a code. Ultimately, these are your observations, and if you observe something coming out of the artifact, then you should document it as a code, even if you're maybe taking a smidge bit of a logical jump on your own in order to come up with that code. Also note that certain things in your artifact may carry multiple codes and have multiple meanings. So once you have your codes done, start searching for the themes. This is merely recognizing the patterns in the codes. I would say that in order to start doing this third step, it should very much look like the first step. Sit down, look at your codes, read them multiple times, digest them. The patterns, if you're observant enough and spend enough time with your codes, should organically emerge. And then review your themes. Just note when you come up with your themes, do they make sense in this context? Do they provide answers to your initial research question? And then lastly, defining and naming your themes. Naming your themes is especially important and should be well considered. The reason is the name that you give your theme, or the definition that you give your theme, should encapsulate all of the codes within that theme, yet at the same time not be applicable to codes outside of that theme. So basically there, you want to make sure that your themes are distinct from one another, and also incorporate all of the observations that you have in your codes. Which isn't difficult, but I would also say isn't necessarily easy. Just because you have to stop and actually think about it for a little bit. You have to digest the information and see what are those patterns that are emerging. Now, I will note that you may end up having, by the time you're done with your themes, some what I would call orphan codes. I would expect most of your code should fit into themes, but maybe not necessarily all of them. You may have noticed when you're looking at my coding and my themes, my 9 code, the implicit ideal person is a fit, physically active, and thin person. That I kind of inferred out of this one sentence right here, but in all honesty, by the time I got to my themes, I didn't see it as fitting into a pattern. So it didn't actually end up making its way into my themes. And that's okay. I mean, there may be things that you directly observe that when you establish the patterns, you notice that one thing is a one-off or doesn't necessarily fit within the patterns that develop into your theme. That's okay. The majority of your codes should develop themes, but some may not. Some may be kind of awkward, and you may not necessarily 100% have a place for that one. It's okay to perhaps leave it as an orphan code. So all that said, this is the basic process of thematic analysis. It's pretty intuitive. If you're sitting there thinking, well, this seems like a little too simple, well, it's not supposed to be complicated. It is a systematic process of doing sociology, and sociology is intended to just understand the world around us. And so, like I said, you already do that to a certain extent as a inquisitive person about the social world. And so I would say take the time, enjoy this. I mean, the only difference between this and what you would naturally do is it's more systematic. So choose artifacts that you're going to enjoy familiarizing yourself with, and you think are going to be packed with meaningful data to put into themes to answer your research question. As always, if you have any questions coming out of this, feel free to hit me up. Best of luck developing your respective projects, and I am always here to help if needed.